The dust cloud rose behind the mail coach as it lurched to a stop outside the general store in St. Louis, Missouri. And Jake Morrison felt his heart hammer against his ribs like it did every other Thursday when the letters came from back east. He stood there in his worn boots and sun-faded shirt, sweat trickling down his temple in the brutal August heat of 1878, watching the postmaster sort through the canvas bag with hands that seemed to move slower than molasses in January. Jake was 24 years old, built strong from years of working cattle ranches and riding fence lines, but standing here waiting for something he could not even read made him feel smaller than a child. The other men collecting their mail barely glanced at him as they tore open envelopes and scanned the contents, their eyes moving across the pages with an ease that Jake had never known. He had grown up on the frontier, the youngest of 7 children to parents who could barely feed them, let alone send them to school. His father had died when Jake was 8, kicked in the head by a spooked horse, and his mother had followed 2 winters later from pneumonia. Jake had been passed between his older siblings like an unwanted burden until he was old enough to work. And by 12, he was already earning his keep mucking stalls and mending fences for whatever rancher would hire him. Reading and writing were luxuries for people who had time and money, and Jake had never had either. He had learned to sign his name with an X, learned to count money well enough not to be cheated, learned to read the sky for weather and the land for water. Those skills had kept him alive and fed, but they had not prepared him for Florence Jenkins. "Morrison," the postmaster called out, his voice cutting through Jake's thoughts. "Got another one for you." Jake stepped forward and took the envelope, his calloused fingers careful not to crease the fine cream paper. The handwriting on the front was elegant, the letters flowing across the surface like water over smooth stones. He knew it said his name and the town, but beyond that, the symbols might as well have been ancient hieroglyphics. He nodded his thanks to the postmaster and walked out into the bright sunlight, tucking the letter carefully into his shirt pocket, right over his heart. He had met Florence Jenkins 6 months ago when she had arrived in St. Louis on the riverboat from Philadelphia, accompanying her aunt, who had inherited a property on the outskirts of town. Jake had been hired to repair the barn and mend the fences on the neglected homestead, and he had been checking the stability of the barn doors when she had walked in, brushing dust from her traveling dress and looking around with eyes the color of spring clover. "You must be the handyman my aunt hired," she had said, and her voice had been like music, cultured and gentle but not condescending. "I am Florence Jenkins. I appreciate you helping us get this place in order." Jake had pulled off his hat, suddenly aware of how rough he must look with his wind-burned face and dirt under his fingernails. "Jake Morrison, madam, just doing the work I was hired for." She had smiled at him then, a real smile that reached her eyes and made something in his chest tighten. "Still, it is good to know there are reliable people here. Philadelphia is so different from this place. Everything here feels more honest somehow, more real." Over the following weeks, Jake had found excuses to linger at the property, taking on additional repairs that probably did not need immediate attention. Florence would bring him water and sometimes sit on the porch steps while he worked, talking about her life back east, about the books she read and the places she had seen. She never seemed to mind that Jake mostly listened, offering only brief comments when she asked him questions about the land or the animals or the way of life out here. She had been 22 then, educated in a finishing school, able to speak some French and play the piano. Her aunt had brought her west, hoping the change of scenery would help Florence recover from a broken engagement to some wealthy merchant's son who had run off with his secretary. Florence never talked about it with bitterness, only a kind of resigned sadness that made Jake want to punch the faceless man who had hurt her. "I thought I knew what love was," she had told him one afternoon while he was replacing boards in the barn. "I thought it was about social standing and shared acquaintances and attending the same church." But when he left, what hurt most was not losing him, but realizing I had never really known him at all. We had never talked about real things, never shared anything beyond pleasantries and expectations. Jake had not known what to say to that, so he had just kept working, but he had thought about her words for days afterward. The day everything changed had been in late March, when the first real warmth of spring had started melting the last of the winter snow. Florence's aunt had fallen ill with a fever, and the doctor had prescribed bed rest and time. Florence had made the decision to return to Philadelphia temporarily to settle some family business and arrange for her aunt's care. "I will be gone for several months," she had told Jake on that last afternoon, standing in the barn where they had spent so many hours talking. "But I would very much like to write to you, if you would not mind. I feel like I can talk to you about things I cannot share with anyone else. You listen in a way that makes me feel heard." Jake's heart had soared and plummeted in the same moment. He wanted nothing more than to hear from her, to maintain this connection that had become the best part of his days, but the shame of his illiteracy burned hot in his throat. "I would like that, madam," he had said, the lie feeling heavy on his tongue even as he spoke it. "You write whenever you want." She had squeezed his hand then, her fingers soft and cool against his work-roughened palm, and he had felt the touch like a brand that marked him as forever changed. The first letter had arrived 2 weeks later. Jake had taken it to the bunkhouse where he lived at the cattle ranch where he now worked full-time, and he had stared at it for hours, trying to will the symbols into making sense. He had considered asking someone to read it to him, but the thought of sharing Florence's private words with strangers made his stomach turn. Those words were meant for him, and having someone else voice them felt like a violation of the trust she had placed in him. That night, lying on his narrow bunk with the letter pressed against his chest, Jake had made a decision. If Florence Jenkins thought him worthy of her letters, then he would damn well make himself worthy. He would learn to read. The next morning, Jake had walked into the small schoolhouse on the edge of St. Louis and waited for the teacher to arrive. Miss Martha Patterson had been a spinster of about 40, wire-rimmed spectacles perched on her narrow nose, and she had looked at Jake with surprise when he had asked if she would teach him to read. "I can pay," Jake had said quickly, pulling out the coins he had been saving for a new saddle. "I work hard and I learn fast. I just need someone willing to teach me." Miss Patterson had studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Come by every evening after supper. We will start with the alphabet and go from there. But I warn you, Mr. Morrison, learning to read as an adult is not easy. It takes dedication and patience." "I have both," Jake had assured her, and he had meant it with every fiber of his being. The first weeks had been humiliating. Jake, who could break a wild horse and track an elk through miles of forest, who could shoot a rattlesnake at 20 paces and navigate by the stars, struggled to remember that the symbol that looked like a stick with a circle was the letter B and not D. The letters swam before his eyes, refusing to stay in the order he tried to memorize them. His hand cramped from gripping the pencil too tightly as he practiced forming the shapes over and over on the slate Miss Patterson provided. "You are trying too hard," she told him one evening when he threw down the pencil in frustration. "Reading is not like roping a steer, Mr. Morrison. You cannot force it into submission. You have to let the patterns reveal themselves to you. Let the sounds and symbols connect naturally." Jake had taken a deep breath and picked up the pencil again. Every night he returned, and every night he pushed himself a little further. He carried the slate with him to work and practice during his lunch break, scratching out letters in the dirt when he had no paper. The other ranch hands gave him strange looks, but Jake did not care. The second letter from Florence had arrived, and then the third, and each one he stored carefully in a wooden box under his bunk, promising himself that he would read them all when he was able. By June, 3 months into his lessons, Jake could sound out simple words. Miss Patterson had given him a children's primer, and though it felt foolish to be reading about cats and dogs at his age, Jake worked through each page with grim determination. The breakthrough came one evening when he was reading a sentence about a boy and his horse, and suddenly, the words just flowed. He was not sounding out individual letters anymore, but seeing whole words, understanding their meaning as his eyes passed over them. "Very good, Mr. Morrison," Miss Patterson had said, and there had been genuine pleasure in her voice. "You are ready to try something more challenging. I suspect you have some particular motivation for learning so diligently." Jake had felt his ears burn red, but he had nodded. "There is a lady who writes to me. I want to be able to read her letters myself." Miss Patterson had smiled, the expression softening her stern features. A worthy goal. Nothing motivates learning quite like matters of the heart. Now, in late August, Jake finally felt ready. The 7th letter from Florence had just arrived, and tonight, after 5 months of struggling and studying, he would read it by himself. His hands shook slightly as he walked back to the bunkhouse, and he could barely focus on his work for the rest of the day. He nearly fell off his horse twice while checking the north fence line, his mind already racing ahead to the evening. When supper was finally finished, and the other ranch hands had settled in for card games and drinking, Jake took his lantern and the wooden box of letters and walked out to the barn. He needed privacy for this, needed to be alone with Florence's words when he finally understood them. He settled into the hay loft, arranged the lantern so the light fell across the page, and with trembling fingers, opened the first letter she had ever sent him. "Dear Jake," he read slowly, his lips forming each word carefully. "I arrived safely in Philadelphia after a long journey, but I find myself missing the wide skies and honest conversation of St. Louis already." His heart hammered as he continued, each sentence revealing thoughts and feelings Florence had shared with him months ago. She wrote about feeling trapped by the expectations of her family, about the suffocating politeness of society gatherings where no one said anything real. She wrote about remembering their conversations in the barn, how Jake's quiet observations about the land and animals had taught her to see beauty in simple things. "You have a poet's soul, Jake Morrison, though I suspect you would laugh at me for saying so. But the way you described watching the sunrise over the prairie, how the light turns the grass to gold and makes the whole world feel new, that is poetry of the truest kind." Jake had to stop reading and wipe his eyes. He had said those things to her, had shared his private observations because she had seemed genuinely interested, but he had not realized they had meant so much to her. He read through the first letter twice more, absorbing every word, then moved to the second. The second letter was longer, written in what Florence described as the middle of a sleepless night. She wrote about the man she had been engaged to, about how she had realized she had agreed to marry him not because she loved him, but because it was expected of her. She wrote about how meeting Jake had shown her the difference between going through the motions of life and actually living it. "When I am with you, I feel like I can breathe. You do not expect me to be anyone other than who I am. You do not care about my family's social standing or whether I can manage a household according to Philadelphia standards. You listen when I talk about books and ideas, and you share your own thoughts without pretension. I have never known anyone quite like you." By the third letter, Jake was crying openly, not bothering to wipe the tears that tracked down his weathered cheeks. Florence wrote about missing him, about counting the days until she could return to St. Louis. She asked him questions about the ranch, about the horses he was training, about whether the wildflowers had bloomed yet in the meadow behind her aunt's property. She shared pieces of her daily life, the tedious social calls and family dinners, always circling back to how different it all felt from the authentic connection she had found with him. The fourth letter contained a confession that made Jake's breath catch in his throat. "I think I am falling in love with you, Jake Morrison. I know I should not write such things, that it is forward and improper, but I am tired of pretending and playing games with my feelings. You are good and honest and true, and when I picture my future, it is not in Philadelphia ballrooms but on the Missouri frontier with you. Is that madness? Perhaps it is, but it is the first thing that has felt right in my entire life." Jake read that passage 5 times, his hand pressed against his chest as if to keep his heart from bursting through his ribs. She loved him. Florence Jenkins, educated and refined and beautiful, loved him. The wonder of it was almost too much to bear. He continued through the remaining letters, watching the progression of Florence's thoughts and feelings. She wrote about her struggles with her family, who wanted her to remarry someone appropriate, someone from their social circle. She wrote about standing firm in her decision to return to St. Louis, to her aunt, and to the life she had begun building there. And in every letter, she mentioned Jake, asked about him, wondered what he was doing and whether he thought of her as often as she thought of him. The newest letter, the one that had arrived that morning, was both the shortest and the most important. "Dear Jake, I am coming home. My aunt's affairs are settled, and I have arranged for her continued care from afar. I will arrive in St. Louis on September 7th on the afternoon riverboat. My heart races as I write this, knowing that I will see you again soon. I have missed you more than words can express. I hope these letters have not been a burden to you, and that you might feel even a fraction of what I feel. With all my affection, Florence." September 7th was 10 days away. Jake set down the letter and stared out the barn loft window at the stars scattered across the black sky. 10 days until Florence returned, until he would see her face and hear her voice in person rather than just on paper. 10 days to find the courage to tell her that he loved her too, that he had learned to read just so he could understand the gift she had given him in these letters. The next morning, Jake asked his boss for the day off and rode into St. Louis to see Miss Patterson. She looked up from her desk as he entered the schoolhouse, and her eyebrows rose in surprise. "Mr. Morrison, we do not have a lesson scheduled for today." "No, madam," Jake agreed, pulling off his hat. "I came to thank you proper. I read all her letters last night, every single one. And I would not have been able to without your help. You gave me something more valuable than I can repay." Miss Patterson's expression softened. "The look on your face is payment enough, Mr. Morrison. I take it the letters contained welcome news." "She is coming back," Jake said, unable to keep the smile from his face. "And she says she loves me. I need to learn how to write now, madam. I need to be able to write her back, to tell her what is in my heart." "Then we had better get started," Miss Patterson said, pulling out a fresh piece of paper and a pen. "Writing is more challenging than reading in some ways, but you have already proven you have the dedication needed. Let us begin with your first letter." For the next week and a half, Jake spent every spare moment practicing his writing. His letters were crude at first, shaky and uneven compared to Florence's elegant script, but they were his own. Miss Patterson helped him with spelling and grammar, but the words themselves came straight from his heart. He wrote and rewrote the letter a dozen times, wanting it to be perfect. On the evening of September 6th, the night before Florence's arrival, Jake finally completed a version he was satisfied with. He read it aloud to Miss Patterson, who had agreed to stay late to help him. "Dear Florence, I have read all your letters, every word. I learned to read so I could understand what you wrote to me, because your words were too precious to share with anyone else. You taught me that love can speak every language, even to a man who did not know his letters. I have loved you since the first day you walked into that barn, and I will love you until my last breath. When you come home tomorrow, I will be waiting. Yours always, Jake Morrison." "It is perfect," Miss Patterson said, her eyes suspiciously bright behind her spectacles. "She is a lucky woman, Mr. Morrison." "I am the lucky one, madam," Jake replied, folding the letter carefully. "She saw something in me worth loving before I even saw it in myself." The next day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Jake tried to work, but he was useless, nearly cutting his own hand while mending tack and spooking the horses with his nervous energy. Finally, his boss told him to just go into town and wait for his lady before he caused an accident. Jake did not need to be told twice. He rode into St. Louis 3 hours before the riverboat was scheduled to arrive and spent the time pacing the dock, his letter folded in his pocket and his heart in his throat. Other people gathered as the departure time approached, but Jake barely noticed them. His entire world had narrowed to the bend in the river where the boat would appear. When the steamboat finally came into view, its paddle wheel churning the brown water white, Jake thought he might faint from the pounding of his heart. The boat pulled up to the dock, and passengers began disembarking, but Jake only had eyes for one person. Florence appeared at the top of the gangplank, dressed in a traveling suit of deep blue, her dark hair pinned up under a small hat. She was scanning the crowd, clearly searching for someone, and when her eyes found Jake, her entire face lit up with a joy so radiant it took his breath away. She hurried down the gangplank, propriety forgotten, and Jake moved to meet her. They stopped just shy of touching, suddenly aware of the crowd around them, of the expectations and rules that governed how unmarried people should behave in public. But Florence did not seem to care. She reached out and took both of Jake's hands in hers, squeezing them tightly. "I have missed you so much," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I was afraid I had been too forward in my letters, that you might not want to see me again." "I have something for you," Jake said, pulling out the letter with shaking hands. "I read all your letters, Florence, every word. And I needed to write you back." Florence took the letter, her eyes widening as she unfolded it and began to read. Jake watched her face as her eyes moved across the page, watched the tears begin to fall and the smile that trembled on her lips. "You learned to read," she whispered, looking up at him with wonder. "You learned to read so you could understand my letters." "They were too important not to," Jake said simply. "You were too important. And I needed you to know that I love you too, Florence Jenkins. I love you more than I have words for, but I am learning the words so I can tell you every day for the rest of my life, if you will let me." Florence laughed through her tears and did something completely scandalous. Right there on the public dock, she threw her arms around Jake's neck and kissed him. Jake froze for half a heartbeat, then wrapped his arms around her waist and kissed her back, pouring 5 months of longing and love into that single perfect moment. Around them, people gasped and whispered, but neither of them cared. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless and flushed, Florence kept her hands on Jake's shoulders and looked into his eyes. "I will let you tell me every day for the rest of our lives, Jake Morrison. And I will tell you in return. Love speaks every language, but I think we have found our own." The scandal of their public kiss spread through St. Louis like wildfire, but it did not matter. Florence's aunt, recovered from her illness, gave them her blessing with a knowing smile. Miss Patterson attended their wedding in October, dabbing at her eyes as Jake recited his handwritten vows. The ceremony was simple, held in the small church at the edge of town, but to Jake, it was more magnificent than any cathedral. They moved into a small house on Florence's aunt's property, and Jake continued working at the ranch while Florence established a small school for the children of homesteaders who lived too far out to attend the town school. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch, and Jake would practice his reading while Florence corrected papers, occasionally reaching over to squeeze his hand or share a smile. Their first Christmas together, Florence gave Jake a leather-bound journal. "For your thoughts," she said. "You see the world in such beautiful ways, Jake. I want you to write them down so we can keep them forever." Jake had been terrified of the blank pages at first, but with Florence's encouragement, he began to write. Simple observations about the changing seasons, about the horses he trained, about the way the sunset painted the sky. And always, he wrote about Florence, about the miracle of their love and the gratitude he felt every day that she had chosen him. Florence wrote too, continuing to keep a journal as she had in Philadelphia, but now her entries were filled with joy instead of restless longing. She wrote about teaching the children, about the satisfaction of watching them learn and grow. She wrote about Jake's gentle strength, his kindness with the animals, the way he listened when she talked about her dreams and fears. The winter was harsh that year, and by the time spring arrived with its promise of renewal, Florence had news that made Jake dizzy with happiness. She was carrying their child. Jake had immediately become protective to the point of being ridiculous, barely letting Florence lift anything heavier than a book, but she tolerated his worrying with amused patience. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, Jake Morrison," she told him, laughing at his insistence that she stay off her feet. "I am healthy and strong, and Dr. Williams says everything is progressing perfectly." Their son was born in late September of 1879, during a thunderstorm that rattled the windows and turned the world outside silver with rain. Jake held Florence's hand through the long hours of labor, feeling helpless and terrified, but when the baby finally arrived, red-faced and screaming, Jake wept with relief and wonder. They named him Thomas, after Jake's father, and he had Florence's green eyes and Jake's dark hair. Jake had never imagined himself as a father, had never thought he would have a family of his own, but holding that tiny life in his work-roughened hands, he felt a love so fierce and protective it rivaled even what he felt for Florence. Florence recovered quickly from the birth and returned to teaching after a few months, bringing baby Thomas with her to the schoolhouse. The other children adored him, and he grew up surrounded by learning and laughter, by books and horses, by the wide prairie sky and the love of two parents who had found each other against all odds. As Thomas grew from baby to toddler to young boy, Jake continued his own education. He read everything he could get his hands on, from agricultural journals to novels Florence brought from back east. He discovered he had a talent for writing, and he began keeping detailed records of the ranch operations, noting which breeding methods worked best and which grazing rotations kept the cattle healthiest. His boss, impressed by Jake's dedication and intelligence, promoted him to foreman. Florence's school grew too, attracting students from miles around. She taught not just reading and arithmetic, but also history and science, opening worlds to children who might otherwise never have access to such knowledge. She never forgot what it had meant for Jake to learn to read, how that single skill had changed the entire course of their lives, and she was determined to give that gift to as many children as possible. In the summer of 1882, when Thomas was almost 3, Florence gave birth to twin girls. Jake had been terrified when Dr. Williams had announced there were 2 heartbeats, worried about the dangers of a twin pregnancy. But Florence had sailed through the pregnancy with surprising ease. The girls arrived on a bright June morning, one right after the other, and they were as different as night and day despite being born minutes apart. Sarah had Florence's delicate features and her father's serious nature, while Elizabeth was all wild energy and laughter from the moment she drew breath. Jake loved them with the same fierce intensity he loved Thomas, and watching Florence with their daughters, nursing them and singing to them and telling them stories, he fell in love with her all over again. The years that followed were full and rich. The house that had seemed so spacious for two became cramped with 3 children, so Jake built an addition, working evenings and weekends to create more bedrooms and a larger kitchen. He discovered he was good with his hands, that he could take rough lumber and transform it into something useful and beautiful. Thomas showed an early aptitude for reading and writing, no doubt from growing up surrounded by books and his mother's teaching. By the time he was 5, he was already helping Florence teach the younger students their letters. The twins were equally bright, but in different ways. Sarah loved animals and would follow Jake around the ranch, asking endless questions about the horses and cattle. Elizabeth was drawn to music and would sit for hours at the piano Florence's aunt had given them, picking out melodies by ear. Jake continued to write in his journal every evening, a practice he had maintained for over 5 years now. His entries had evolved from simple observations to longer reflections on fatherhood, marriage, and the life he had built. Sometimes Florence would read them and add her own thoughts in the margins, creating a dialogue that spanned the pages. One evening in the fall of 1884, Jake was writing by lamplight while Florence mended clothes and the children slept upstairs. He paused, looking up at his wife, and was struck again by the impossibility of their life together. "What are you thinking?" Florence asked, noticing his gaze. "I was just remembering that first letter you sent me," Jake said. "How I stared at it for hours, wanting so badly to know what you had written. I never could have imagined it would lead to all this." He gestured around the room at the home they had made, the family they had created. Florence set down her sewing and came to sit beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "You taught yourself to read for me. Do you know how extraordinary that is? How much courage and determination that took?" "You gave me a reason," Jake said simply. "Before you, I did not see the point. I got by just fine without reading. But your letters, your words, they mattered too much to let someone else interpret them for me. I needed to understand you in my own way with my own eyes. And you taught me something just as valuable," Florence said softly. "You taught me that love is not about social standing or expectations, or doing what everyone thinks you should do. Love is about seeing someone truly, understanding them, and choosing them every day. You saw me when I did not even see myself." Jake kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of the lavender soap she used. "We saved each other, I think." "We did," Florence agreed, "and we built something beautiful from it. The children grew older, and with them, Jake and Florence grew too. They faced challenges, as all families do. There was the winter of 1885 when influenza swept through the area, and all 3 children fell ill. Jake and Florence took turns sitting up through the long nights, sponging fever-hot foreheads and praying desperately for their children's recovery. When Thomas, Sarah, and Elizabeth finally turned the corner and began to improve, Jake and Florence held each other and wept with relief. There were financial struggles too. The ranch went through hard times when a drought hit in 1886, and Jake's wages were cut. Florence took on additional students and Jake hired himself out for extra work whenever he could find it. They ate simpler meals and made do with patched clothes, but they never went hungry and they never lost the house. Through it all, they wrote to each other. Even though they lived together, shared a bed and their days, they continued to write letters. Sometimes Florence would leave a note for Jake to find when he came in from work, just a few lines about something that had happened that day or a thought she wanted to share. Jake would respond in kind, his handwriting still a bit rough compared to hers but full of love and meaning. When Thomas turned 10 in 1889, he asked his father to teach him to ride and work cattle the way Jake did. Jake had worried that Florence might object, wanting their son to focus on his studies, but she had encouraged it. "He needs to know both worlds," she said. "Books and learning are important, but so is knowing how to work with your hands, how to understand animals and the land. You can teach him things no book ever could." So Jake began taking Thomas with him to the ranch, teaching him to rope and ride, to track and tend cattle. The boy was a natural, fearless, and quick learning, and Jake felt a deep pride watching his son master skills that had taken Jake himself years to learn. But unlike Jake at that age, Thomas could also read the agricultural journals and apply scientific principles to ranching practices. He was the bridge between Jake's world and Florence's, equally comfortable with a lasso or a book. The girls grew into their own interests as well. Sarah did indeed become skilled with animals, and by the time she was 8, she was helping deliver foals and calves, her small hands gentle and sure. Elizabeth's musical talent blossomed, and Florence arranged for her to take lessons from a piano teacher who had moved to St. Louis from Chicago. The sound of Elizabeth practicing filled the house every evening, and sometimes Jake would waltz Florence around the kitchen while their daughter played, making her laugh and the children giggle. In 1890, Florence's aunt passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 72. She left the property to Florence and Jake, along with a sum of money she had been carefully saving. It was not a fortune, but it was enough to make real improvements to both the house and the land. Jake used some of it to purchase cattle of his own, building a small herd that he ran on the property alongside his work at the main ranch. Florence used her portion to expand the school, building a proper schoolhouse that could accommodate more students. The growth of both their enterprises meant more work, but also more satisfaction. Jake was no longer just an employee but a landowner, a rancher in his own right. Florence's school became known throughout the region for the quality of its education, and families moved to the area specifically so their children could attend. Life was not perfect. There were disagreements and hard days, times when money was tight or the children were difficult, or the work seemed overwhelming. But through it all, Jake and Florence held fast to what had brought them together in the first place: honest communication, deep respect, and a love that had proven stronger than any obstacle. On their 10th wedding anniversary in October of 1889, Jake gave Florence a gift that he had been working on in secret for months. It was a book, hand-bound in leather, containing copies of all the letters they had written to each other over the years. He had painstakingly copied each one, preserving not just the words but the journey they represented. Florence wept when she opened it, her fingers tracing the familiar words. "This is the most precious thing anyone has ever given me," she said. "Our story in our own words." "I wanted our children to have it someday," Jake said. "I wanted them to know how we found each other, how love can overcome anything when two people are willing to meet each other halfway." Florence pulled him into a kiss, deep and full of promise. Even after 10 years of marriage, the spark between them had not dimmed. If anything, it had grown stronger, tempered by shared struggles and joys into something unbreakable. That night, after the children were asleep, they sat together on the porch as they had done so many times before, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Florence was reading from the book of letters while Jake simply held her, content to listen to her voice bringing their past back to life. "Do you remember," Florence said, pausing in her reading, "when you told me that you did not have words for how you felt? That day on the dock when I first arrived back from Philadelphia." "I remember," Jake said. "I had just learned to read and write, and it still felt like the language did not have enough words to express what was in my heart." "You have given me so many words since then," Florence said softly. "Beautiful words in your letters and your journal entries. But do you know what I treasure most? The way you love me without words, too. The way you bring me coffee in the morning just how I like it. The way you braid Sarah's hair when I am running late. The way you listen when I talk about my students, really listen. Love speaks every language, Jake, and you speak them all." Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You taught me that, Florence. You taught me that love was not just something you feel, but something you do, every day in 100 small ways. Before you, I thought I was less than others because I could not read. But you showed me that there are different kinds of literacy, different kinds of intelligence. You valued what I knew even while teaching me what I did not." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Then Florence spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "I received a letter from Philadelphia yesterday. My cousin is getting married next spring, and she wants me to come for the wedding." Jake felt a flicker of the old insecurity, the fear that Florence might return to her old life and realize what she had given up by choosing him. But he pushed it aside. They were long past such doubts. "You want to go?" he asked. "I think I would like to," Florence said. "But only if you come with me. I want to show you where I came from, introduce you to my family, and I want them to see the life we have built, the man I chose and why." "Are you sure?" Jake asked. "I am not exactly polished society material, Florence. I will probably use the wrong fork and say the wrong things." Florence laughed and turned in his arms to face him. "Jake Morrison, you are worth 10 of those polished society men. You are honest and hardworking and kind. You learned to read so you could understand my letters. You have built us a beautiful life and raised 3 incredible children. Anyone who cannot see your worth is not worth worrying about." So in the spring of 1891, Jake and Florence made the journey to Philadelphia, leaving the children in the care of Miss Patterson, who had become like family to them over the years. It was Jake's first time traveling so far from Missouri, and he found the crowded eastern city overwhelming at first. The noise and the press of people, the soot from factories and the formal manners, all of it felt foreign and slightly suffocating. Florence's family received him with polite wariness at first. They were clearly surprised that Florence had married a rancher, a man who had taught himself to read as an adult, someone so far removed from their world. But Jake held his head high, remembering Florence's words about his worth, and he answered their questions honestly. At the wedding reception, Florence's cousin cornered Jake while Florence was occupied with other guests. "I hope you do not mind my asking," she said, "but I must know. How did you, a cowboy from Missouri, capture the heart of someone like Florence? She could have married anyone. There were plenty of suitable men here who wanted her." Jake considered the question, then smiled. "I did not try to capture her heart, madam. I just saw her for who she really was, not who society wanted her to be, and she did the same for me. Sometimes love is not about being suitable. It is about being real with each other." The cousin had looked at him with new respect after that, and word of his answer spread through the family. By the end of their visit, even Florence's most skeptical relatives had warmed to Jake. They saw how he looked at Florence, the gentle way he treated her, the pride in his voice when he spoke about their children and their life in Missouri. And they saw how Florence glowed when she was with him, how the restless unhappiness she had carried before moving west had been replaced by deep contentment. On the train ride home, Florence leaned against Jake's shoulder and sighed happily. "Thank you for coming with me. It meant everything to have you there to show them our life is not less than theirs, just different." "Your cousin asked me how I captured your heart," Jake said, toying with Florence's fingers. "I told her I did not, I just saw you." "You did more than see me," Florence said. "You valued me. You listened to me. You learned a whole new skill just so you could understand my words. That is love, Jake. Real, deep, transformative love." They returned to St. Louis and their children, who had missed them terribly despite Miss Patterson's excellent care. Thomas had grown what seemed like 2 inches in their absence, and the twins had 100 stories to tell about their adventures. Life settled back into its comfortable rhythm, the seasons turning as they always did, bringing their work and their joys. In 1893, when Thomas was 14, he approached his parents with a request. He wanted to apply to the agricultural college that had opened in Columbia, Missouri. He wanted to learn modern ranching techniques and then come back to expand the family's cattle operation. Jake felt a surge of pride mixed with trepidation. "College is expensive, son, and it would mean you being away from home for months at a time." "I know, Pa," Thomas said, "but I have been saving my wages from working at the ranch. And Ma says there are scholarships available for students who show promise. I want to make something of myself to make you both proud." "We are already proud of you," Florence said, her eyes shining. "But if this is what you want, we will find a way to make it happen." They did find a way. Thomas received a partial scholarship, and Jake and Florence made up the difference from their savings. Watching their son board the train for Columbia that fall was one of the hardest things they had ever done, but also one of the proudest. Thomas was the first in Jake's family line to attend college, a testament to how far they had all come. With Thomas away, the house felt strangely empty despite Sarah and Elizabeth still being there. The girls were 11 now, growing into young women with their own dreams and ambitions. Sarah talked about becoming a veterinarian, a field that was just beginning to open to women. Elizabeth wanted to study music in a conservatory, perhaps in Chicago or even back east. "They are going to leave us too," Jake said one evening, watching the twins practice their respective passions. Sarah tending to a sick calf and Elizabeth working through a complicated sonata. "They are," Florence agreed. "But that was always the plan, was it not? To raise them to be independent, capable people who could make their own way in the world." "I know," Jake said. "Does not make it easier, though." Florence squeezed his hand. "We will always have each other. That is the foundation everything else is built on." And she was right. As the children grew and eventually left to pursue their own dreams, Jake and Florence remained each other's constants. Thomas graduated from agricultural college in 1897 and returned to help expand the ranch into a thriving operation. Sarah did indeed become a veterinarian, one of the first women in Missouri to do so, and she established a practice in St. Louis that served both the town and the surrounding ranches. Elizabeth attended a conservatory in Chicago and became a music teacher, eventually returning to St. Louis to take over Florence's school when Florence decided to retire. Through all these changes, Jake and Florence wrote to each other. Even when they were in the same house, they left notes and letters, maintaining the practice that had started their relationship. The leather-bound book of letters grew to multiple volumes, a chronicle not just of their love but of their entire life together. In 1905, they celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary surrounded by their children and grandchildren. Thomas had married a teacher he met in Columbia, and they had given Jake and Florence 3 grandsons. Sarah had married a fellow veterinarian, and they had 2 daughters. Elizabeth had not married, choosing instead to focus on her music and her teaching, and she seemed perfectly content with that choice. The house and land that had once seemed so modest had grown into a substantial ranch, and the school Florence had started had become a permanent fixture of the community, now run by Elizabeth, with the same dedication Florence had always shown. Jake's journal writing had evolved into something more ambitious. He had written a book about his experiences learning to read as an adult and about the transformative power of literacy. It had been published by a small press and had found an audience among adult education advocates. On the evening of their anniversary, after the party had ended and the family had gone home, Jake and Florence sat on the porch as they had done countless times before. They were older now, Jake's hair silver and Florence's dark locks threaded with white, but the love between them was as strong as ever. 25 years, Florence mused. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime, and sometimes it feels like no time at all. Best 25 years of my life, Jake said. You took a rough, unlettered cowboy and showed him there was more to life than just getting by. You taught me to read, to write, to see beauty in words and ideas. You gave me a family and a purpose beyond just surviving. And you took a restless, unhappy woman who was trying to fit herself into a life that did not suit her, and you showed her what it meant to be truly seen and valued, Florence replied. You learned to read just to understand my letters, Jake. Do you know how rare that is? How special? You could have asked anyone to read them to you, but you respected my words and our connection enough to do the hard work of learning yourself. Jake pulled her close, and they sat watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The prairie stretched out before them, wild and beautiful, and Jake thought about how far he had traveled from that day on the dock when Florence had first returned from Philadelphia. He had been so nervous then, so uncertain, clutching his roughly written letter and hoping it would be enough. It had been more than enough. It had been the beginning of everything. Love speaks every language, Jake said softly, echoing the words Florence had said to him all those years ago. But I am glad we learned to speak each other's. The written word, the spoken word, and all the ways we love each other without words at all. Florence tilted her face up to kiss him, and in that kiss was the history of their life together. Every letter written and read, every challenge overcome, every joy shared. They had built a love that transcended the differences in their backgrounds and education, a love based on mutual respect and genuine understanding. The years continued to pass, bringing their share of losses and gains. Florence's health began to decline in her early 60s, arthritis making it difficult for her to write with the same elegant script she had once possessed. Jake learned to help her, steadying her hand when she wanted to write letters to the children or make notes about the school. When she could no longer write at all, he became her scribe, taking down her words with the careful penmanship he had worked so hard to develop. In 1912, when Jake was 58 and Florence was 56, she became seriously ill with pneumonia. The doctor warned Jake that her lungs were weak, that the illness might be more than she could overcome. Jake spent days at her bedside, reading to her from their collection of letters, reminding her of their journey together. Do you remember, he said, his voice rough with unshed tears, when you told me you were falling in love with me in that fourth letter? I read that line 5 times, could not believe that someone like you could love someone like me. Florence, weak but still present, squeezed his hand. I knew then what I know now. You are the best man I have ever known. Learning to read was impressive, but it was why you did it that mattered. You did it for love, for connection, for understanding. That is who you are, Jake Morrison. She recovered from the pneumonia, but she was never quite as strong afterward. She retired from active involvement in the school entirely, content to advise Elizabeth from the comfort of their porch. Jake retired from ranching too, leaving the operation to Thomas and his sons. They spent their days together, reading and talking and watching their grandchildren grow. On a warm spring morning in 1915, Florence woke Jake before dawn with a gentle touch. "Come watch the sunrise with me," she said, "like you described it in that first letter I sent you. I want to see the light turn the grass to gold." They sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, watching the sun rise over the prairie. The light did indeed turn the grass to gold, painting the whole world in shades of amber and flame. Florence leaned her head on Jake's shoulder and sighed contentedly. "Thank you," she said softly, "for learning to read, for seeing me, for building this beautiful life with me. I could not have imagined anything better." "Thank you for teaching me that love speaks every language," Jake replied. "You changed my life, Florence Jenkins Morrison. Every day with you has been a gift." Florence passed away peacefully 2 days later in her sleep, with Jake holding her hand. She was 59 years old, and she left behind a legacy of education and love that touched countless lives. The school she had founded continued to operate, teaching generations of children. The family she had built with Jake flourished, spreading out across Missouri and beyond. Jake grieved deeply, feeling like half of himself had been torn away. But he found solace in the letters they had written to each other over the years, in the journals they had kept, in the children and grandchildren who carried forward the values Florence had instilled. He continued to write every day, now addressing his journal entries to Florence, telling her about the family and the ranch and the way the world was changing around them. He lived for another 8 years, long enough to see 2 great-grandchildren born, long enough to see Sarah's veterinary practice thrive and Elizabeth's school expand, long enough to see Thomas's ranch become one of the most successful in the region. He never remarried, never even considered it. Florence had been his one true love, the woman who had seen past his rough exterior to the man beneath, who had inspired him to reach beyond what he thought possible. On a cold November morning in 1923, Jake Morrison died in his sleep at the age of 69. He was buried next to Florence in the small cemetery outside St. Louis, their headstones side by side. Thomas placed the leather-bound books of their letters in Jake's coffin, a final testament to the love that had defined his father's life. At the funeral, Elizabeth read from one of Jake's last journal entries, his handwriting shaky with age but still legible, still full of love. "I learned to read so I could understand her letters, but she taught me so much more than literacy. She taught me that love speaks every language, the language of words and the language of actions, the language of sacrifice and the language of patience. She saw value in me when I could not see it in myself. She waited while I struggled to form letters and sound out words, never making me feel lesser for my lack of education. And when I finally could read her words, I discovered she had been saying I love you in 1,000 different ways, just waiting for me to understand. I spent 50 years learning the languages of love she taught me, and I will carry those lessons wherever I go next. Wait for me, my dearest Florence. I have one more letter to write to you, and this time I will deliver it in person." The family wept, but they also smiled, knowing that Jake and Florence's love story was complete. They had found each other across differences that might have kept them apart, had built a life and legacy that would endure for generations. Their children and grandchildren carried forward the lessons they had taught. That love requires effort and understanding, that true connection comes from seeing and valuing each other as you really are, and that it is never too late to learn something new if the motivation is strong enough. The school continued to bear Florence's name, and the ranch bore Jake's. The books of letters were preserved by the family, passed down as treasured heirlooms. And in St. Louis, Missouri, people still told the story of the cowboy who learned to read just to understand the letters from the woman he loved, and the woman who taught him that love speaks every language, if only you are willing to learn. Their story became a legend of sorts in the community, told to young couples as an example of what real love looked like. It was not about grand gestures or perfect circumstances. It was about a man willing to struggle through the humiliation of learning his letters as an adult, because the alternative, not understanding the woman he loved, was unthinkable. It was about a woman who saw past social conventions and education levels to recognize genuine goodness and worth in another person. It was about two people who chose each other every day, through letters and conversations, through hard work and harder times, through the raising of children and the building of a life. In the end, Jake and Florence Morrison's legacy was not just the ranch or the school or even their descendants, though all of those were significant. Their legacy was the proof that love, real love, can bridge any divide. It can cross social classes and education levels. It can motivate extraordinary effort and inspire personal transformation. And it can endure, not just for a lifetime but beyond, touching people who never even met them but who heard their story and believed a little more in the possibility of finding that kind of connection themselves. The cowboy learned to read just to understand her letters. She taught him love speaks every language, and together they wrote a story that would be remembered long after the last word was written and the final page was turned.